This week in virology, the introduction is made by Vincent Racaniello on May 7th, 2020. He initially states that we are in the middle of a pandemic caused by SARS-CoV-2 that could have been prevented. After SARS-1 in 2003, we knew that bats in China harbor corona-like viruses, some of which with pandemic potential. We should have then isolated some of these viruses, designed antiviral drugs, maybe even vaccines to inhibit a broad range. These mentioned being called pan-coronavirus therapeutics. However, no one did this because of lack of financial incentive. Therefore, in 2019, when SARS-CoV-2 emerged, there was nothing we could do. Today's talk is from December of 2019 in Singapore at a Nipah virus meeting between Vincent Racaniello, Richard Hatchett, the CEO of CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovation, and Lin-Fa Wong of National University of Singapore, Duke, who studies SARS-like coronaviruses in bats. As we dive into the discussion, we begin by hearing from CEO of CEPI, Richard Hatchett. He tells us the organization was established in January of 2017 and that it came about as a recognition that emerging epidemic viruses presented a threat and that the international community was not organized to develop vaccines against them. He goes on to state that the problem with epidemic diseases is that they are so rare and market forces don't drive the development of vaccines because it takes a long time and it's risky. So, CEPI was set up as a collaborative effort of a number of sovereign countries to collect funds to support vaccine development efforts against diseases like Ebola, including Nipah, Lassa, MERS, and other emerging viruses. Vincent asked Richard if CEPI was his idea, and he responds with no, stating that it was really an idea that a group of global health leaders came together on, though he did take part in some of the planning. Vincent mentions how it's interesting that the Ebola virus vaccine is cited on CEPI's website as an example of how we had a vaccine for many years and it took a year into the West African epidemic to deploy it, and this is what they wish to prevent from happening again. He sees irony in this as the vaccine was initially developed for the army to prevent viral terror attacks. Hatchett says that this is true, and he states prior to working with CEPI, he worked in the U.S. biodefense program, and there had been long investment in the development of Ebola vaccines, but it was driven by concerns about Ebola as potential bioterrorism threat, not because of the recognition that Ebola vaccines were needed for global health purposes. He mentions that it is unsurprising that we don't worry about people's health, saying that this is relevant to the development of vaccines for Nipah. The concern for Nipah, like Ebola, is the range of the reservoir species. It's vast. There's at least 2 billion people living where Nipah emerging might occur. What's needed is the right social potential and a transmissible virus for the virus to explode, which is what Ebola found in West Africa after being a known virus for 40 years. Nipah we've known about for 20 years. We've seen large outbreaks, but nothing comparable to West Africa, and that is what CEPI is trying to prevent. Vincent says that it seems to him that there is growing enthusiasm for the idea of making vaccines against rare but potentially devastating viruses and stockpiling them in case of an outbreak. Richard confirms that he believes so and mentions a point that he often brings up at venues is emerging epidemic diseases represent a threat which is very characteristic of the world we created for ourselves. It reflects ecological factors, but also the interconnected nature of the world and increasingly dense and well-connected populations. He doesn't believe that we should think about epidemic diseases exclusively with other global health problems like HIV, TB, or malaria, because, well, then it becomes a zero-sum game. Instead, believing that we should look at epidemic diseases like we look at other transnational problems, which require a collective response like international terrorism or climate change. They discuss the startup of CEPI and how they're doing financially, which is quite well, securing $850 million of either direct investment or aligned investment, with other investors considering currently. Vincent jokes that they are the modern-day March of Dimes movement, and Hatchett says, I think so, though the polio story was a very interesting story in that it was emerging awareness of polio, particularly in the 1930s because of Roosevelt, which in the late 40s and 50s became almost a panic in America, stimulating the development of those polio vaccines. Gavi announced just the week prior to this meeting that they're opening a funding window to create a global vaccine stockpot, which Hatchett says is a tremendous advancement for global health and in the fight against emerging epidemic diseases. Hatchett says in later discussion how CEPI is working in a multilateral environment where all of the organizations that are contributing have their own priorities, their own agendas, and it's all truly a coalition of the willing with no command authorities. These men, as prior mentioned, are all outside of this podcast in Singapore for a NEPA meeting in which CEPI is the co-sponsor. Vincent asks Richard what he hoped to accomplish by co-sponsoring this event. Hatchett states that CEPI has accepted Nipah as one of the 5 viruses in addition to Ebola that they are focusing on. Therefore, they have already invested in the development for a Nipah vaccine. They have candidates that they are hoping to move on to clinical trials in humans within the next year. So, they saw an opportunity to bring the community together, to inject energy into them, to not exclusively focus on CEPI's activities, but to focus attention on Nipah for the next few years and to try to take it off the table, move these products forward and improve surveillance and improve diagnostics. He states that Nipah is a dangerous disease, but that there is no reason we have to let another West Africa happen in order to address this threat. When CEPI was initially established in January of 2017, they issued a call for proposals initially only focused on Nipah, Lassa, and MERS. This call was put out globally to propose development for vaccines. It took 14 months to establish their first partnerships. Since March of last year, they have a portfolio of 26 vaccines that they are supporting the development of. The 5 diseases they now cover, in addition to Nipah, Lassa, and MERS, are chikungunya and Rift Valley fever, all of which have been identified by the WHO through their R&D blueprint as either priority or, in the case of chikungunya, an urgent disease that don't have effective countermeasures. Hatchett states that the funds they are injecting into the system to support the vaccine development and to support some of the enabling science that goes along with it actually sort of exerts a magnetic draw and pulls other researchers in, creating a momentum across the whole array of countermeasures. He states that the C in CEPI coalition is really important, that what they're really trying to do is not only be a product development partnership that's investing in particular products, but actually trying to change and create an ecosystem that is conducive to the development and ultimately the sustainability of these products. This includes working with organizations like Gavi, the WHO, and UNICEF to establish stockpiles and create criteria for deploying the stockpiles, using the products, but also creating understanding and awareness of the pathogens and in a demand for the products to address them. CEPI's first 5-year goal is to take all of these candidates, with exception of a couple of the MERS vaccines they're supporting, into preclinical development, and the goal is to carry them through to phase 2 in clinical trials and to establish investigational stockpiles. That is, the stockpiles of these candidate vaccines that are meant for deployment into clinical trials in the event of an outbreak. He believes that in the next 5 years, they hope to go beyond that, ultimately wanting these products to be able to be under some sort of regulatory mechanism. Part of CEPI's core mission is not just to develop vaccines, but to ensure access to those vaccines for the populations that need them as global public goods. Vincent asked Richard what he believes will be the soonest into trials, and Richard responds stating that they already have 2 loss of vaccine candidates in phase 1 of clinical trials. These are the first loss of vaccines ever to make it to human clinical trials. A number of the MERS vaccines that they're supporting already reached phase 1 before their funding, and there are some very promising Nipah candidates. One of the most promising, he believes, is actually based on the licensed Hendra equine vaccine in Australia. The only issue with this is that it is combined with an adjuvant that is only used in veterinary vaccines, so it would have to be reformulated, but the preclinical evidence for that vaccine against Nipah is very promising. So, one of the goals of this Nipah meeting was to showcase all of CEPI's work to let everyone see what was going on. Vincent asks how governments have responded to CEPI, and Hatchett says that it's a really important part of their model. Going back to the coalition aspect, they believe it's important to have the private sector and sovereign funding partners, and critically important that the countries at risk for the diseases they are focused on be involved, not only waiting to be a potential product recipient, but actually engage them into the development process. Hatchett says that the exciting thing about this Nipah conference is that they have 245 participants with over 100 from at-risk countries. He sees this as important because he believes they need to be deciding whether these vaccines are actually products they can use, and if so, become prepared to use them. Vincent wraps the discussion with one last question for them, saying, "We have a bunch of known viruses, and then there is disease X. So, if next week we have disease X, would you respond in some way?" Hatchett says absolutely CEPI would. One aspect of our program is development of rapid response platforms. Nipah was disease X 20 years ago. Ebola was disease X 40 years ago. What we don't have right now are capabilities to rapidly develop definitive countermeasures against these new diseases. So, a whole section of CEPI's funding is focused on developing vaccine technologies that offer benefits in terms of speed. Speed in terms of time to generating a candidate vaccine, speed in terms of time to scaling up production, and speed in terms of time to actually providing clinical benefit. Unfortunately, the commercial markets for these vaccines don't put a premium on speed of development and instead put it on safety and efficacy. Hatchett believes we need to make strategic investments to drive technologies that might offer these benefits. And if we can develop such technologies, we can provide a broader social dividends in terms of democratizing access to vaccines and potentially making vaccines available for other applications like oncology. Lin-Fo Wang adds that their worry being upon safety and efficacy is due to the fact that they are mostly not dealing with emerging or emergency diseases. And he states that this conference, someone will introduce that the idea if disease X comes from gene sequence to a vaccine candidate will take 16 weeks. So Wang wraps up in saying that we need this different mindset when developing vaccines against emerging diseases. So speed is essence. Vincent Racaniello closes his podcast with stating he thinks that CEPI is a great model for developing vaccines so that we'll be ready for the next pandemic. He ends with this quote, "This is how our life-saving drugs need to be developed going forward."